Hey guys, I'm back with round 3 from the 2019 US Amateur Team West. So at this point, my team was on 2-0, 2 out of 2, and doing quite well. And I had won my second game, and I was kind of able to forget about my first loss because the team won anyway, and I was able to bounce back with a win. So now I felt like the tournament was just starting all over again. So in round 3, we were paired against a pretty good team. Mostly, I think, actually pretty much completely comprised of juniors. And on board 1, I was playing National Master Eric Lee, who's quite a talented player because he's already hit 2200, and I believe he's just 11 or 12 years old, so really young. Okay, so he played d4, knight f6, c4, g6. I went for the King's Indian. He's a pretty principled player, and here he went for the classical line with knight f3, castles, and h3. So very popular line these days, and definitely one of the more dangerous attempts that white has against the King's Indian. I ended up going with knight a6. This is the line I have typically liked to play against the h3 King's Indian. Mainly because in this line, I think black is usually able to avoid some of the really dangerous attacks after g4 that white often gets in the main lines. For instance, with like e5, d5, and a5, white often goes g4 in these positions, and because the center is closed, white gets, I think, a very serious initiative here. And actually not only plays for the attack, but often just plays for having like a big space advantage. So this opening is kind of dangerous for multiple reasons. So I went with knight a6. I think this is a more flexible move. It keeps the center open. So white can't really just go g4 the same way, because then at least black gets c5 and I can keep the position open. Like after d5, the bishop on g7 is of course open, where it wouldn't be if my pawn was on e5. And here we would get a Benoni type of structure where if I can play e6 and then play rook e8, I should be able to get really good counterplay on the e-file. So he plays bishop a3. I think this is the right approach, not to commit with g4 until black has decided what he's going to do in the center. So c6 this is a good waiting move. I'm preparing to play e5 in the future, and then when white plays d5, in many positions I might take on d5 or I might push c5. But because my pawn is on c6, I'll kind of have that choice when the time comes. So here he goes for bishop e2. I don't think this is the most critical move. I think rook c1 is theoretically the most challenging move. And there is a game Nepomniachtchi played against Ariban, which I think was really important for this line. I believe it went e5, d5, and then takes, knight e8, if I'm not mistaken. I could be getting the move order wrong, but basically black went for this idea with intentions of playing like f5 very soon, even after white pushes g4. So that game was really interesting. If you're curious about this line, I would encourage you to go analyze that one. But in this game, he went for bishop e2, which is definitely a natural move, but yeah, I feel like this one is less critical. So I go for e5, and of course the pawn is not quite hanging, because at the end of these lines, black typically has knight takes e4, and is usually able to win back the pawn with a pretty reasonable game, because the knight on a6 is ready to jump to b4 and is going to be very, very annoying from there. And of course the bishop on the long diagonal is really strong. So white pushes d5. I think this is the correct move, and then I played knight h5. And the idea is just to put the knight on f4. I think queen d2 here is one of the main lines. And then black can go ahead and just play knight f4 anyway, because if white accepts this pawn, then black typically gets a lot of compensation in this type of position, mainly by attacking the e4 pawn. So the first moves I would consider would be something like knight c5, rook e8, and eventually even playing for f5. But I should point out, with the knight on c5, rook on e8, black is already threatening to take on c3, cripple white structure, and then win back the pawn on e4. But we also have this f5 idea to just play for a lot of activity. So black is typically fine there, but I don't think white can. I don't think he has to take on f4. He can also just castle and played this type of position. And I think Adibon played queen f6 here. Adibon is a real specialist in this line, and he's had multiple games, and seemed like black was getting enough play on the diagonal. Instead, Eric went for castling, which I don't think is as critical. And based on the time he was spending, at least a few minutes per move, I feel like he wasn't quite familiar with the position, although I didn't ask him after the game, so I don't know exactly where his knowledge ended. But I went knight f4, just following my idea. He goes rook e1. And now if I let him play bishop f1, I think white gets a pretty decent defensive setup there. Can follow up with like king h2 and then g3. So I think it's pretty important for black to take this bishop off the board. So I play knight takes e2, rook takes e2, and finally I push c5. And here I felt very comfortable with my position because we essentially have a kind of a classic King's Indian where both sides are castle kingside, but white is going to be attacking on the queen side. The plan like a3, rook b1, b4, and black is of course going to be pushing on the king side with f5. So we have this very thematic middle game, but with the difference being that I've already traded off a knight for white's light-squared bishop, which I think is good for me because I think the light-squared bishop, although it seems like a passive piece, is a very, very good defender, especially on the light squares for white. So I feel like in this position with the light-squared bishop, and the fact that I got in c5 is definitely a good version of this for black because I can play for f5. I also have the idea of playing for b5. So overall, I felt very comfortable here. In my preparation, I basically have it up until this position, and the evaluation is black is okay. Alright, so he goes knight e1. I think this is pretty reasonable to transfer the knight either to d3 or c2. I pushed f5, and then after some thought, he takes on f5. I think this is a correct choice. At least it's better than playing f3 because in this typical position where black gets the closed center and gets this kingside attack, I think this is just a really good version because I'm just immediately playing h5 and g4 very soon. My rook can come to f6 and g6, and white is very far away from being able to do anything on the queen side, so black just seems way ahead here. So he takes on f5, g takes f5, and f4. And I think this is a good approach in this kind of position to try and fix the position and block the center. But after e4, I still think black is doing quite reasonably here. This is a pretty common structure where white just kind of plays for the blockade. But I think because I have the pawn on c5 again, this gives me an opportunity to play for the b5 break, and I feel like this very natural plan is quite helpful for black here. So I felt really comfortable in this position. Okay, he goes queen d2, bishop d7, knight c2. I play knight c7, threatening already to go b5, and he pushes a4. Now I had a kind of an interesting decision to make because I wasn't quite sure how to proceed. If I play a6, I was worried that he would just play b4 and actually beat me to the punch on the queen side. And then if I go b6, he can do something like a5, and it seems like my queen side is almost falling apart. I have to be very careful about taking on b4 in these types of positions because when white recaptures, I've given away the d4 square, and so white can use this square for his pieces, and structurally I think white is doing quite well. I feel like any move such as queen f6 in this kind of position is usually just met with rook c1, and yeah, black doesn't have a whole lot to be happy about here. So I knew I couldn't just allow him to play b4, but I didn't want to play a5 and just block up the queen side, at least not yet, because I felt like black should be trying to open the queen side if I want to break through and win the game. So eventually I came up with this move queen f6 in this position, just prophylactically stopping white from playing b4 because I'm putting pressure on the knight. And here I was really expecting rook a3. I thought this was just an important move in order to defend the knight and try to play b4. And then I'm not sure what exactly I would have done here. I was definitely thinking about knight a6, trying to maybe play knight to b4, but I think after rook b3, it's not that clear what black is achieving with this. I can also play something like b6, then white would probably play b4, and maybe even a5. I was analyzing this a bit after the game. I think this is what the engine likes, and yeah, it's kind of a tough position to evaluate, especially if white just plays b5 and blocks everything up. If he doesn't play it, then I think black is doing quite well, because the knight will get to b4, but after b5, the queen side is just totally blocked. And then I was thinking about a move like king f7, which, yeah, it seems to just start facilitating the transfer to the other side. Like rook can come to g8, bishop goes to h6. Black should start doubling on the g file, and maybe eventually trying to bring the knight to f6 and h5. And yeah, I have no idea. I mean, white has a lot of knights that are pretty typically good in close positions. Objectively, I would definitely take black here, because I feel like black is the one who has more chances to break through, but whether I would be able to or not is a completely different story. So rook a3 was really the critical move here. Instead, he goes rook a2, which makes sense because he's defending the b2 pawn, but the problem is it's not helping him achieve b4, which I felt like was white's only real idea in the position, because the knight on c3 is just still hanging. So now I realize that I have a lot of time, and I figured his idea is to play knight to b5, because he's defending the b2 pawn. But I wasn't quite concerned about this, so I pushed b6. And I think I can do this. A6 was also an option, but then white goes a5, and I'm not able to break so easily. I have to play rook b8 and only then b6. But I thought I could just play this right away and try to prepare this break for the future. So then he goes knight b5. I think he felt like he didn't really have another move. And now I have a choice. I can take with the knight or with the bishop. I really wanted to take with the knight here, but I think it ends up being a mistake. After a takes, I kind of have to play a6 to try and break through. B takes a6, b5. This was kind of the main idea I was considering, but I really couldn't make it work after white plays the move b4, which looks like a very sharp move, but it's quite reasonable for white. I mean, just getting the pawn off of the diagonal and trying to break through on c5, and of course if I take, the knight can take and secure the a6 pawn, which is quite nice for white. So I was trying to evaluate this over the board, and I really couldn't figure out what was going on. I would probably play b takes c4, and then checking it with the engine afterwards, I think it was correct of me not to go for this, because it's very, very unclear. I think white is objectively fine if he finds the right moves. So yeah, that looked tempting, but I'm glad I avoided it. I also consider knight e8, which is actually a really interesting choice. Just avoiding the trade and preparing a6 next move. But okay, eventually I decided to just keep it simple. I took with the bishop here, a takes b5 and a6. So I'm making this break on the queen side. And now I played knight takes a6 here, but I really should have just taken with the rook. And the point being is that after the trade of rooks, I figured white would go b4. I have this nice move, queen b2. When I just infiltrate with my queen, and now black is just playing for positional pressure on the queen side. So takes, and yeah, I think black is just clearly better here. The rook can come to b8, and in the long run, I'm always trying to attack the c4 pawn. I got a similar version to this during the game, but white didn't have to allow it. So I play knight takes a6, and then he goes b4 here, which actually I was expecting, but it turns out to be a mistake. He had a very nice move here to play rook e1. It was a really cool idea. I mean, basically he's just trying to fight for the a file with a very, very timely like rook retreat. And now when I play knight c7, which I wanted to do during the game, at least this was my plan, then he can just play rook a1, and he's not giving up the a file, so black doesn't get as much play. After b4, which I was more or less expecting but also hoping for, now after knight c7, he's forced to kind of give up the a file. If he goes rook takes a8, rook takes a8, he can play bc5, bc5. It looks really nice for black because the rook is coming in, and again, I'm just going to be targeting this pawn for the rest of the game. Whereas his pieces, they have a nice blockade, but they don't have a whole lot of targets, so it makes his position quite passive. Instead, he goes for knight a3, which I think is playable, though it does look a little bit awkward. And I decided to go rook a4 and just double on the a file. bc5, bc5, and he plays knight b5, just immediately trying to unpin before the second rook gets to a8. I felt this was fine, but I also felt like black is starting to take over, because I can trade on a2 as I did, queen takes a2, and I throw in rook a8 to take the a file, and now queen b3. Okay, so here I really felt it was like a critical moment, because I have a lot of options. I have rook a1 check, I have queen a1 check, I have this move rook to b8, and I have the all-important decision of whether I want to trade the knights or keep the knights with a move like knight to a6. So I spent a lot of time here, probably like 10-15 minutes, just sorting through my options and trying to figure out, because I knew I had a serious advantage here. I just didn't know how much and how exactly I was supposed to break through. So overall, the biggest advice I can give in this kind of situation is you just want to take as much time as you reasonably can without drifting into time trouble. Try to find a plan where you can play for some kind of long-term weakness. Because if you go for some immediate attack, then you basically just have to calculate and make sure that it works. But if you're unable to do that, then you'd be taking a big risk by going for some attack that might not end up working out. So more than anything, I really just wanted to stay in control over the game, not take too much risk to try and win, and try to keep him from getting counterplay. I think this is generally a good strategy in this kind of position. So yeah, after queen a1 check, I basically couldn't figure out what to do after the move king f2. King h2 would be, I think, nice for black after something like queen f1. I can just start bothering white's pieces and trying to come in with the rook to a1. But king f2, he kind of keeps everything defended, and I didn't quite see how to break through here. So if I take on b5, he takes with the queen. His queen is ready to come in and start attacking my position. So the f5 pawn is hanging, d6 pawn is hanging, and of course, if my rook ever leaves, he wants to start giving checks and trying to give a perpetual. So not seeing a very clear way forward with queen a1, I decided actually just to keep it kind of simple. So I ended up trading on b5 right away, forcing him to choose here if he wants to take with the pawn or take with the queen. Taking with the pawn, I think, would be a mistake, because now after I play queen a1 check, king f2, I'm able to go rook a3, and his queen doesn't have a way to infiltrate into my position. So white here is most likely going to be losing the b pawn, like queen c4, rook a4. Then I play rook b4 next, and it's just like the dream Benko gambit. Black's pieces are controlling the diagonal, controlling the queen side, and white is really just probably just losing here, losing the b pawn at least. So he plays queen takes b5. I think this is the right choice, and I decide to just keep it very, very solid with queen d8. And my point was that eventually I want to just round up all the squares on the queen side and kick his queen away from being active, which I think was generally a good plan. Okay, I understand with queen c7, rook a5, I'd be allowing queen e8 check, but maybe I even start with king f7 first, and then finally I play rook a5 when all of the entry squares are covered. I can also think about playing just simple move like rook b8 in some cases. I felt this was a good idea because he simply has no way to do anything active, and he kind of just has to sit and wait. Mainly his rook is a big problem for him because it doesn't have b2 square and it doesn't have the a2 square, so it just can't get in on the open files. He goes for king h2, just calmly improving the position, and I decided to play h5. My idea is that I want to fix him with h4, then maybe play bishop h6, and I guess this is what we call starting to turn the screws. Putting pressure here, trying to look for rook a3 ideas, and then rook takes e3 tactics, and basically just trying to put pressure on white from different angles until something breaks. He ends up going for bishop c1, which seems like he has the idea of playing bishop b2 and trading off the bishops. But right now this move runs into rook to b8, so I decided I can just keep improving my position. He can't play bishop b2 yet, so instead he goes queen b3. And here I think I made a really good decision. If you guys would like to treat this position as an exercise, you can pause the video and try to figure out how black should proceed here. And it's not like there's a forced win or something, but it's really just an important, I think, moment as far as technique goes and how to convert advantages. So I spent a lot of time here again trying to figure out how to play the position. I looked at mainly rook a1, as a forcing move, bishop b2, rook b1, something like this. But then queen a2, I think, and he just immediately unpins. I also considered a move like bishop d4, with idea bishop b2 to back it up with queen f6, and basically white just can't trade bishops and allow black these two central pawns. They would just be way too strong. But white doesn't have to trade bishops, so he simply wouldn't have to go bishop b2 here. He can just play bishop e3 and just keep sitting on the position, and it's not clear what my bishop is going to be doing on d4 because I don't really want to take on e3 yet. So eventually I figured out that maybe I don't need to keep the queens on the board, and I decided to go for this move queen b8. I feel like this is a very unpleasant move for white because if he trades queens, then he's in a very passive endgame. It might just be losing for him because he has no counterplay, and black can just break through build up endlessly until we break through. But if he keeps queens on the board, then he has to give up some ground, meaning he has to play queen c2, and now black controls both of the files on the queen side, and this seems like an excellent improvement of the position for black. And I can continue with like queen b4, rook a4, and just immediately going after this pawn. So eventually he decides to trade queens, and I think this was a really good decision on my part to allow the queen trade, because initially I wanted to keep the queens on the board to just keep potential attacking chances alive. But then I realized that I have really good chances in this endgame, mainly because my pieces are going to be more active. Of course, I have this protected passer in the position that is always threatening to push. And I also felt like my king is going to be more active, which I think is going to be the deciding factor here. So I play bishop d4. I keep his king from coming in. He decides to go g3. I think he kind of has to, because otherwise I'll play rook b3 and fix him on this square. So g3, I take on g3, king takes g3, and king f7. And now I'm actually threatening to give rook to g8 check and force his king back to the h file where it'll just be cut. So it's really not a great position for white. He ends up playing king h2 right away, and I decide to invade with the rook. So now I have a threat simply to play e3 and e2, where the pawn is promoting. So he has to play king g2 to keep his king within range of the pawn. And now it would definitely be a mistake to push if he can just play king f3, because this pawn will either be blockaded or simply taken. So I really have to wait before making this push. But instead I figured, okay, king g6, I can bring my king a little bit closer, and then I'm always kind of threatening to invade potentially. So bishop d2, rook g1 check, king h2, I back up. He goes bishop c3. And I think I could trade bishops here, but I definitely felt like it was way too early to do this because, of course, he's not really threatening to trade because my pawn on d4 would be way too strong. So I played rook a4 here, hitting the pawn, forcing him to go back, and king h5. And so the problem for white is that he's basically just tied down to this pawn, and he doesn't have a way to activate the rook. Even if he plays like rook g2 here, I'll simply play bishop f6 to cover the square, and then he has to go back because otherwise I'm just taking the pawn. So king g2, he continues to wait. I played rook a1, check, rook d1, then he goes here. Then I realized, my rook isn't achieving much on the d file, so I give another check, put it back on a1. He goes king g2. Now I definitely have to be careful and avoid a 3-time repetition because I'm on the verge. But I decided to keep my rook on the third rank. And around here I kind of figured out the winning plan. I realized that with my king this close on h5 and my rook super active, I actually can trade bishops via bishop f6, bishop h4. Because when we get this rook endgame with bishop takes, king takes, I will be threatening to take the h3 pawn. And if he ever does anything like rook b2 and then trying to come in actively, rook b8 or rook b6, with my king on h4, I'll always have rook a2 check. And the king will have to be pushed back, and my king will get into his position with king g3, and then I can take the f4 pawn, and it's a very, very easy win. So it sounds kind of complicated, but it's actually more of a schematic decision. You have to kind of picture the bishops go off the board, and you see where your king and rook can break through. And once you do that, it's not hard to see that black is just breaking through on the king side. So he goes bishop e1. I played rook d3. Just in case he allows me to play e3 and rook d2 in some positions, that would be really nice. But he goes bishop g3. Now I pull back, bishop f6, and I'm threatening to play bishop h4. So he plays bishop e1. And I think I found a nice way to break through here with rook f3. So if he defends the pawn with bishop g3, then I'm going to play bishop h4, and we're basically getting this rook endgame, where I'm just threatening to take on f4 or just give check and take here, and basically white isn't nearly in time with counterplay. And if he goes bishop d2, then I'll probably go bishop back to d4, and now I'm threatening to play rook f2 check and then e3, which is just a deciding threat. And if he goes to bishop e1, then, well, I'm ready to take on f4. So he eventually goes rook f2, which is a decent try, but after bishop h4, I was able to calculate that I'm winning in basically all the endgames. The key line being after rook takes f3, e takes f3 check, king f1 is forced, I can trade bishops, king takes, king h4, king f2, king takes h3, king takes f3. And if I keep going this way, then of course his king just follows me and I'm not able to get in. But black has a nice move, king h4, which basically puts white in zugzwang, and I'm winning the king and pawn endgame because white's king has to make a move in every position and black's king simply comes in and takes the pawn. So seeing that this one was winning, then I realized bishop h4 is just game over. He plays rook e2 because he obviously also understands that the king and pawn endgame is just losing, so he goes into the rook endgame. But now king h4, and I'm essentially breaking through as we kind of saw before. He goes rook a1, and yeah, I think I was very good with my technique here because I don't even take any pawns yet. I just play rook c3, wanting to play check and come in with my king because I don't need to win the h3 pawn to win the game. What I need to do is put my king on f3 and push the e pawn forward. So he comes in with rook a6, rook c2 check, king g3, and I'm even willing to give up a pawn, which he takes, just because the active king is way too strong here. Now I'm threatening a checkmate on the back rank, so king e1 is met with e3, and if king d1, for example, now I can take on c4, and then I'm going to push e2 next move and promote the pawn. Or if he goes something like rook e6, okay, I can give check and take the pawn, or I can play rook a4 and then give check, and the pawn will be promoting soon. So instead he goes king to g1, which doesn't really make much of a difference. I played e3, rook a6. This is kind of a last-ditch effort, because if I played e2 here, this would run into rook a3 check and king f2, where he actually gained some stability, and it's not obvious that black is breaking through here. But I was just more accurate with rook c1 check, giving the check first, pushing his king, e2. Now rook a3 check, his king, of course, can't stop the pawn, and it's just game over, so he resigned here. Well, yeah, I was quite happy with this game. Of course, he had some chances in the middle game, but it was pretty complicated, and once I achieved this kind of strategic advantage in the structure here, where long-term black is just doing quite well, I was quite happy that I wasn't afraid of the endgame, so to speak, and I was willing to go here, realizing that it would be very easy for me to improve my position, and eventually I was able to find a good plan to break through. Actually, exchanging is, I think, one of the most important technical tools that one has. If you exchange the right pair of pieces, you can leave your opponent with a very passive position that's just kind of impossible to hold. So this was definitely my best decision of the game. So yeah, this was a nice win, and now we also won the match, so we were on 3-0 and heading into a very tough round 4. So thank you guys for tuning into this video, and I'll catch you in the next one.